We all know well the story of how God created the world that we read at the beginning of the Scriptures. We're drawn back to that in our first reading tonight, of how he made a garden for his first people, Adam and Eve. And in this beautiful garden, God had made everything perfect. They had all the food they needed. They had everything that you could possibly want to be happy. But as we heard in the first reading, the devil hated God. And so he disguised himself as the serpent to trick Adam and Eve. And instead of trusting God and calling out to him, that first woman and man disobeyed and ate from the tree that they had been told not to. Adam and Eve could no longer stay in the garden because that garden was now ruined by sin. And all the evil that we have in the world today and all of the bad things that we ourselves do are because of the ruin that original sin has done. But God planned to make us new and to free us from this sin. And just like when he created the first man and woman, he made them in a beautiful garden, so before remaking us, he would make another garden. And this would be a garden where no sin would ever enter. It would be a perfect garden from which everything we would need to be happy and every spiritual food would grow. A garden so pure that God would send his own Son, Jesus, into it. And this garden was our Blessed Mother Mary. God gave Mary the great gift that no sin would ever enter her. Jesus, as a tiny baby, would grow inside of her, just like Adam lived in the Garden of Eden. Only in this case, Jesus and Mary would never sin as Adam and Eve did. Mary would never be ruined as that first garden was. That first garden had everything that Adam and Eve needed to be happy. And now from the Garden of Mary would be born the one person that we need to be happy, Jesus. In the garden, Adam and Eve had all the food that they needed. And inside Mary grew Jesus, the bread of life, the Eucharist, the food that is better than any other food, the food that leads us to heaven. And this mystery of God creating Mary to be like a new and a beautiful garden that would never be ruined by sin, we call the Immaculate Conception. The Immaculate Conception, Mary being without sin for her entire life, reminds us too that we have that same hope. The hope that Jesus comes to free us from sin and death. No, not that any of us were immaculately conceived. We were all born with that original sin. And even though we've been baptized into God's family, we still choose to think sinful thoughts, to say sinful words, to do sinful things. Sometimes by what we do, and sometimes by the things that we fail to do. And that is why Jesus died and rose again for us, and why he calls us to repentance during this first part of Advent. Why he gave us the gift of the sacrament of reconciliation. And the fact that you'll find us priests many more hours in the confessional over the next few weeks attest to the truth that not a single one of us were conceived without sin. So let us not pretend as though we were immaculately conceived. I know that for some, you may be hesitant to come into the confessional. Be not afraid. How much Jesus wants you to receive his mercy and his forgiveness, a greater abundance of his life than you have now, just as Mary received. So often we choose to live like fallen Adam and Eve, but Jesus wants to help us to be more like Mary, to become holy like his mother, so that we may join them in heaven. May we ask Mary to help us to make our hearts to be a home, a garden for Jesus, that we may be the garden where the love of Jesus and his mother is shared with others.